The immediate question, of course, is what's the pressing hurry to write a book, right? And this book sort of comes after my 1 year of silence. I decided that it was quite important to leave the public space for my successor and let him establish a sense of what the RBI was going to be under his regime. And it was also a time that I could spend in reflection. And one of the things that I thought about as I was in this year of reflection is that one of the greatest joys of my term at the RBI was talking to young people, how excited they were, how enthusiastic they were. Both people inside the RBI, I found asking young officers to do something was enormously rewarding because they'd start out without knowing what to do. And after a few weeks, they'd come back with a product that anybody in the world would be proud of. They always rose to the challenge. But also, whenever I visited colleges and universities, I got a sense of the enthusiasm of the young people in this country who are really our future. So I thought maybe I could give them a sense of what it was like being at the RBI, which I think is probably the most exciting position for an economist to be in. It's a wonderful place. You have tremendous freedom to do what you need to do. And so I realized that I had ready material, that I had spent all my time at the RBI giving lectures to the public. And if I just cut and paste the lectures appropriately with some intervening commentary on why they were important under the circumstances, I could give people a sense of what we did and why we did it. And that would give some of the young people a sense of the excitement and also encourage more of them to do economics and finance. And I keep getting emails from people who are doing that, which I think is probably the most rewarding part of having been at the RBI. So also a more subtle reason, which is I think we initiated a lot of reforms over that period. And I wanted to explain the rationale for some of those reforms so that they keep going, because I think they're very important to create the platform for India's continuing growth into the future. So those were two very important reasons. The third was much more mundane, which was that Krishnan Chopra from HarperCollins asked me to write a book, and he is very persuasive. So at some point I succumbed to that and wrote this. Now, of course, when people look at this, they look at the title and they say, what kind of title is this? Why did you come up with this title? And actually, I should attribute the title entirely to my wife, who came up with it. And she remembered a press conference where I think it was Lata Venkatesh, who wants the copyright for this particular question, who asked me, are you a hawk like Volcker or a dove like Yellen? And she's very sort of strong on these bird analogies. And I was a little tired. Actually, at one of the earlier press conferences, Urjit had said we are owls. And that didn't go well because the owl is not particularly as somebody says, aapne hame sabko ullu bana diya. So that was not an appropriate response. But anyway, I tried to respond to the statement. And given the sort of James Bond kind of language that had been flowing around, I probably should have said, my name is Raghuram Rajan. Instead, I said, my name is Raghuram Rajan. And I couldn't sort of rewind and say the right thing. And by the time I got locked into the statement, I had to say something else. And, I was very careful during my entire tenure not to say anything more on monetary policy than I wanted to. And in that process, perhaps roil the markets. So given that I had to complete the sentence, I said, my name is Raghuram Rajan, and then lamely, I do what I do. I thought this is the sort of lamest thing one could say, which my kids firmly agreed with, but it turned out to be something that made the headlines, partly because I think it seemed to suggest that I basically had a fair amount of independence, which was absolutely right. I worked with two governments. And I carried out an agenda which was largely laid out in my first speech, but which also had been prepared in the report that I put together in 2007-8, the Committee for Financial Sector Reforms. I have to say there was absolutely no interference in carrying out that agenda. I had very cordial relationships with both governments, kept them informed, and essentially had government support all along the way. Now, obviously, in public, there's a lot of talk of RBI government tensions, and the resurface periodically. It's something that's been historically built in right from the 1930s. There have always been tensions between the RBI and the government, but I think that sometimes misses, the focus on the tensions sometimes misses the extent to which there is cooperation and there is achievement. Now, as some of you who've been through it know, this is not a tell-all, except for one statement in the introduction on the demonetization. There's nothing on private communications with the government. And to some extent, quoting Naresh Chandra, who was cited by Shekhar Gupta most recently in an article, what I can talk about is not interesting, and what is interesting I cannot talk about. So I think that is entirely true of many sort of the life of many public servants. It would be a violation of trust to talk about that. The one issue that I have mentioned in the introduction is about demonetization, and the reason I mention it is because there were questions asked by parliamentary standing committees to which responses were given, and some of the garbled responses that came out, of course, we know that many of these committees leak. The responses that came out did not seem to accord with my recollection of what exactly happened. So I wanted to set the record straight, just because Parliament has a right to know what, in fact, the response of the RBI on this was. Apart from that, I've tried to preserve a sense of trust and never actually commented on private conversations. But I have given a view. What were we thinking when we did thus and such? How were we thinking about it? Did it pan out as we intended? What kinds of actions did we take? Now, the book begins with our mini crisis in 2013, which was sort of my injection into the RBI. As some of you may recall, in September 2013, we'd just been through two of the most torrid months in my recollection. I was at the finance ministry. The rupee was dropping by a percentage point or two every day. We had spent enormous amounts of money from the RBI trying to protect the currency at that point. Nothing seemed to be working. Of course, the other metrics of health, inflation was quite high. The fiscal deficit, having been brought down somewhat by Mr. Chidambaram after he went into office, was still quite high. We had reached a current account deficit of 6% of GDP in one of the previous quarters. So all the metrics were looking bleak, and we were labeled as part of the fragile five. Of course, we were in the midst of the taper tantrum. Having been at the finance ministry, I knew what had not worked. And I knew that we had to take fairly bold steps and put them together. We couldn't be half-hearted. And I spent the month of August, Dr. Subbarao had been kind enough to allow me to spend time at the RBI. I spent that month trying to find out what are the ideas that are floating around that we can sort of implement quickly, and that we can send as a message to the broader investor public as well as to the international investor that India was continuing its reforms, was unlikely to fall back, and that we were good for the money we had borrowed. Now, some of my, the ideas that the committee I chaired also were there, but the most important point that was dinned into me by my colleagues at central banks elsewhere was emphasize inflation control. The reason the rupee is weakening is because people don't have faith that you will control inflation. Control inflation, everything else will take care of itself. So emphasize again and again inflation control. Don't even talk about the exchange rate. And these came from my Latin American friends who had essentially had similar experiences. And of course, over and above everything else, it was important to convey the sense of confidence that we knew what we were doing, that we would do it, and we would bring stability to the economy.